In this video, we're continuing on with our post implementation, and we're going to start by tackling the two problems that we encountered towards the end of the previous video. This is that the release date should not be null, and that by default our API platform implementation expects us to be sending in data in the format release date camel cased, but we're sending it in release_date or snake cased. So the first of these two issues is with our current entity setup. One way to solve the problem would be to explicitly allow the release date property to be nullable, but that's not what I want to do. Instead, I want to add an assertion onto the release date property to throw a validation exception or a 400 error code, rather than trying to save to the database and failing, which would result in a 500 error code. Once we've made this change, if we were to send in either our test or manually send in the same information via Postman, we're getting ourselves a little bit further. Now it's still an error, but at least the error message itself is nicer. And if you followed along with either the Symfony 4 JSON API approach or the Symfony 4 FOSS REST bundle API implementation, you might be thinking, this is a lot nicer than what we were getting in terms of error messages at this point. But it is still a 400 and it's not the 201, which is what we want. So looking at the violation, we can see that the release date is null and it should not be null. Well, release date is null because we're sending in release_date, as in the snake case representation. So in order to fix this, we just need to follow the documentation. There's two parts to this. We need to firstly enable the camel case to snake case name converter, which should just be copy and paste. And make sure you do this in the services.yaml file. And then under the API_platform.yaml file, we need to specify that the name converter in use is that new camel case to snake case name converter. This is a really nice piece of functionality provided for us with the Symfony serializer component. Now you can use this independently of the API platform, and you can even provide your own implementations as long as they implement the name converter interface. The name converter interface allows the serializer to convert property names of our objects when they go through the serialization and deserialization process. There's a little bit more on this in the documentation, including an example. In my experience, that's quite an uncommon occurrence that I've needed to do this, but the camel case to snake case converter I use quite frequently on an API implementation. You can of course find a link to this in the show notes. So if you do have a custom need here, you can create your own class that implements the name converter interface. So long as you provide an implementation for the normalize and denormalize methods, you can change the property names on your objects however you see fit. Now in my opinion, the naming of these two methods can be a little bit confusing. So to be completely clear, the normalize method is where you would change the name, and the denormalize method is where you would change it back. So taking the example of the camel case to snake case name converter, the normalize method is where we take our camel cased name and we turn it into a snake case representation, and the denormalize method takes that snake case representation and turns it back into a camel case representation. So with the camel case to snake case name converter setup all done, if we send in a post request at this point using our Postman client, we should see that the data ends up in the database as expected. It's pretty good. It means that our post implementation is working. So we should be able to move on to running our various BHAT tests, because specifically the initial background step of given there are albums with the following details really relies on our post implementation being working in order to even set up our tests. However, if we run our tests now, we see a kind of confusing outcome. Even though our tests are green or passing, if we look inside the database, we don't actually see the expected state at the end of our tests. The background step defines 3 different albums that should get posted in initially, and then our post test should also add in a new album. And when looking at the database, we can see that the post test did post in that album as expected, which is kind of why our test is passing, but we don't see those 3 initial albums. And that's quite confusing. Now in the previous videos we set up some logging, so I'm going to make use of that here to tail the logs and then look at the outcome after we've run our tests. And we can see that we get this uncaught PHP exception, where again we're seeing that this content type is an empty string and that's not supported. Now again, that's very similar to what we saw in the previous video, but yet we did apply a fix for that, which was to add in the line and the content type request header is application JSON as part of the background setup step for our BHAT feature. So what on earth is happening here? Well, this is a somewhat unusual and unfortunate side effect of the way that we're running our tests. Our tests have to be completely independent of our various implementations. So we're seeing some sort of weird caveats here that you probably won't ever experience if you was only using BHAT for one project, which would be the typical way to use BHAT, I would imagine. What's happening here is really unintuitive, because we're making a post request as part of the given there are albums with the following details step, that happens before it gets to the next line, which is and the content type request header is application JSON. In other words, these two are happening in isolation, and that's why this is unintuitive. So in order to fix this, I'm going to set the request header inside the initial background step, which, as I say, is partly where the unintuitiveness of this comes in. But once we've done that, if we send in our tests, then unfortunately we hit on another issue, this one a little bit more severe, and that's the track count attribute must be an integer, and we're sending in a string. Now there may be another fix to this. The fix that I'm going to apply is to explicitly cast the track underscore count to be an integer. Now this is a bit horrible, but I can't think of a better way of doing this. Another approach to this may be to use JSON encode with the JSON numeric check option set. This can lead to some unusual and unexpected bugs, so I prefer to be explicit with my casting. As I say, I think the explicit casting looks uglier, but the outcome, in my opinion, is more reliable than deferring this to the JSON encode function. Your opinion may differ, and that's absolutely fine. Now at this point we should have a passing test, and we know that if we can post, then our background step should also be working. This is good. It means that we can now get on with the process of testing all our other endpoints. And so we're going to do that in the very next video. And for completeness, here you can see the JSON encode approach that I was talking about just a little bit earlier.